live. I am here with James Heywood, the head of content for Off to Class. And this is the third video that we are doing in a series of how to teach specific skills in an online environment. So for today's focus is we're going to talk about writing. And we are going to be talking about practical advice for getting students engaged in writing with achievable tasks in an online environment. So writing is important. When your students take IELTS or TOEFL scores, writing is consistently the lowest score. And yet, most online ESL teachers do not teach writing at all. And let's talk about why really briefly before I turn it over to James. Because it feels like we're not participating. It feels like I'm just going to tell the student to write something and then I'm just going to sit and wait, and then I'm going to correct the writing. I don't want to feel like I'm not participating as a teacher. I don't want my student to feel like they should just give this to me for homework, but there are good ways that we can teach writing without being long form in the class, and we can teach it outside of specific writing tasks if we know how. We also struggle because we don't know how to evaluate writing. Evaluating a student's writing is not the same as evaluating, for example, a colleague's writing. And you can just go down a rabbit hole of a million different things, and it could take an hour to correct 5 sentences if you want to go to every little thing. We also don't know how to teach writing. For example, what are the different writing skills? There are different writing skills, but most online ESL teachers and students talk about it as if it's just, I need to improve writing. But we don't talk about speaking that way. We break speaking down into very specific skills. Writing is the same thing. So today, we're going to talk about how you can give writing tasks that have a specific purpose and how it can be done in a way that works in an online class where you can still participate as a teacher. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to James. James, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to comment on the 2 things that you said, and I think that they're really important. The reality is the last study I did read on aggregated scores across culture, across countries for IELTS, I haven't seen for TOEFL, but I'm sure it's consistent, shows that, yeah, surprisingly, writing, the aggregated score for writing across students is considerably lower than the other skills, and it would be great for us as teachers to focus more on writing because of that, because ultimately, writing is a hugely important skill to have. And I know there's a whole group of school of thought out there that, believes that people can't write anymore, but the reality is we still have the need to write. We perhaps don't write as much or in the long form that we used to, but there is still certainly a need. And the other thing that you spoke about, I think, was relevant to the timing. Not every exercise in writing has to be a long form piece of process writing, and that's really what one of the main points that I want to make today. By keeping it short and succinct and a concise exercise, you can really make it something that's achievable and fun, that can be corrected and improved on in the lesson itself. So thanks for pointing those things out. Who is this aimed at? Like the other webinars that we've done today on the listening and reading skills, this is aimed at primarily teachers perhaps who haven't had a huge amount of teaching experience online and will benefit from some tips and some hints around how to teach the various skills in an online environment. And secondly, perhaps for teachers who have maybe run out of ideas and just want to listen through and have a bit of a refresher course or a couple of moments, hopefully, where they, I'd forgotten about that. Hopefully I'll cover a few things there for them. So in terms of what will be covered, what I'll do is go through a couple of strategies that you want to keep in mind when writing. So first of all, we'll go through the writing skills themselves around register, coherence, accuracy, and fluency. And then I'm going to touch on process writing, which is, I guess, long form writing. and you can break that down into the pre-writing stage, and there are some great tasks that you can do there, even if you don't get through to an entire finished piece in one lesson or even two lessons. The idea of some pre-writing tasks, brainstorming, clustering, questioning, there is a bit of overlap in all of those before going on finally to a drafting and editing, which may even take place outside. I think the reality of teaching online, there is a limit to the amount of writing you will want to do, because it does at times feel very one-sided depending on the length of the task. So it's okay, obviously, to go on to a drafting and editing task outside of the lesson itself. So if I go into, before I start into the writing skills, there's a few things around writing that I want to mention, and some of them will be obviously influenced by my own experience teaching writing online. Up until recently, I confess it was probably not the skill that I enjoyed the most, and it was because I used to get stuck trying to get students to write long pieces of writing in a 40-minute lesson, which might work at best with a student teaching one-to-one, but in classes with multiple students, it can become quite an onerous task to feel as those students remain activated and engaged in the task itself. So the first thing I would want to say is a lot of people think that writing is essay writing, and it certainly doesn't have to be. I think it can be a super short exercise that can appear in almost every lesson, and again, not everything needs to be process writing. Obviously, at really low levels of proficiency, and this will depend on individual students. In the curriculum, for example, people will probably have noted that in the curriculum that's divided up, that we have into 66 units, A1 doesn't have at the end of the unit a lesson that focuses solely on writing, simply because at that stage, students are still learning a lot of vocabulary, still learning utterances more than complete sentences, so it's a lot harder. But it doesn't mean you can't attempt it there either.
James, I just want to zoom out and add a very brief bit of context. So what James is referring to there is the off to class step-by-step curriculum. In the off to class step-by-step curriculum, there are 66 units that go from A1 all the way to C1. You can take your student through where they are now, and they'll learn every competency they need at a given level. Now, at everything but the lowest levels, there are 4 lessons per unit of the step-by-step curriculum. And the way James designed it, James wrote all of these lessons. The 4th lesson is kind of the writing lesson, which has more specific writing exercises. But what James was just sharing now is that at those lower levels, there are only 3 lessons per unit. The writing lesson is omitted. So James, you can fill in any gaps that I may have put into that understanding and go from there. I just wanted to contextualize that for anyone who's seeing this that might not be familiar with the curriculum you're referring to.
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Chris. Context is everything. That was definitely an improvement. So thank you. Okay, the next thing I want to go into before I start is probably the most important thing when you do any writing exercise with students. Do not attempt, once students have written something, to correct every mistake. If the purpose, it's an enormous trap to fall into. For example, if the purpose of the writing is just to practice a few linking words, then when you correct or look at the work together, either just as yourself and the student or as peer correction, focus, if you can, almost solely on what you were practicing. The reality is that until students become really proficient, there will be mistakes in various areas of their writing, and it can be very demotivating to have everything corrected. Likewise, make sure that the students are aware that you're just going to focus on the linking words. We're practicing linking words, or we're practicing the present perfect continuous, your ability to write that and use that. Don't worry too much if students use a state verb or a verb that we wouldn't normally use in a continuous tense in that sentence. That's not really what the focus of the exercise should be. So be very wary of how much you're going to correct. And another reason for that is I would say that it's as much for the teacher as the student about correcting mistakes. if you have students who start to understand that you're going to analyze every, phrase, every clause, every piece of punctuation, you are going to have to be a teacher who has exceptional understanding of grammar, and not only of the grammar, but how to explain it to an ESL student. And you will often find, as in with speaking, students will attempt things that are above their proficiency level, showing that they're learning, but in order to explain that, you do not want to be explaining to students subordinating conjunctions, when really what we're looking at here is just make sure you use these nouns with capital letters. So be very careful how much you take on there and how much you think you're willing to correct. I would also make the note there that there are some cultures in which accuracy is focused on. I've heard that some students in some cultures really want to know every single mistake. That will be something that you as a teacher will need to temper. You work that out, but I would advise you to remain very focused on what you're going to actually do in the task.
I think that's something that I struggle with a lot, James, is not one of the reasons I tend to avoid writing when I avoid it is for those two specific things. Number one, it takes forever because I feel like, as a teacher, I feel like I'm doing my student a disservice if I don't correct every little thing. And ultimately, that's not, even if it's not the purpose of the writing, that's making it more about what I think is important than actually like an important learning experience for the student. So if I avoid writing for that reason, then I'm making it about my own discomfort instead of what is best for the student. And the other thing is that you mentioned is huge. It's that when a student writes, and if you want to correct every single little thing, you've got to know about everything in order to be able to correct. And gosh, if a student asks, but why can't I say it that way? And you don't have a good answer, that feeds into my own insecurity as a teacher, and being able to be like, listen, I don't know this well enough. And that's a scary place to be. So it kind of is, it's also a safety net in addition to making it so that a writing activity that's one paragraph or like even 3 to 5 sentences doesn't have to take an entire lesson. You can make it so that you don't have to go down that rabbit hole of how do I explain every single thing and why to say it this way and not that way? Because I also have students who want to know all of it, right? A couple of my students are Belarusian, and I don't know if I don't know if that is a cultural thing or if that's just the two students that I'm thinking of. But the two students that I'm thinking of that happen to be Belarusian, they want to know all of it. And so like I need to be able to as a teacher be like, well, hey, wait a minute. Let's limit to what is a good use of our time. What is the right use of our time? What is a high leverage task for you to be able to get the most out of this? And what is going to be a lot of explanation and a lot of things for something that's not inhibiting your communication at all?
Yeah, I think the two classic cases perhaps that most teachers, even inexperienced teachers, will have already experienced is doing a short writing exercise and then correcting the student about a definite article, and then that will take you down a rabbit hole. And there is no teacher on earth, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that there will be, but there would be teachers who will struggle to explain all of the rules behind the use of or the absence of the articles in English, and that's not a hole you want to go down. And even if you do, and you know it really well, have you just made yourself feel better and in the process confused the student utterly? And is that a piece of, it's absolutely, I think here you've got to be very careful as to what you're going to, which will bring me to the point of purpose in a moment, about the purpose for why we write. I would say also, before I start, I'm still on the before I start, grammar books. I think writing, as much as everything is online these days and great teaching can take place, I've mentioned in a previous webinar that I think a dictionary, whether it's an online dictionary or a old paper hard copy dictionary, is really essential for a student. And likewise, I believe that when a student starts learning English, a physical grammar book is still incredibly hard to beat. to start off with an A1 student or perhaps at the A2 level is a great time to start introducing the fantastic books by either Raymond Murphy or Betty Azar, both of whom have written extensively for students in a very simple way. And those books, there are numerous books not aimed at just writing but grammar, are great compendiums for students to go on as in their learning process to be able to refer back to things as well, because we can learn something about writing and need to come back to it time and time again to practice the form. So I would say a good grammar book, if students can afford it, is a really good investment when it comes to writing. So on to the actual skills themselves. One of the things I think before setting up any task is thinking about the register. This might be more relevant at higher levels of proficiency, B1 and above, but the idea is that in our native language, we use different forms of the language every day depending on our audience. So the question here is, who are we speaking to when we do a task? If we're writing and we're doing something more formal, you might want students to use, again, a dictionary to find certain words that you want to practice, or it's okay if you're just writing down a conversation, then there's a different register, different types of words that are going to be used in a more informal setting.
Can I interrupt you really quickly? One is we have a question from Facebook. What are the authors of those grammar books that you mentioned?
Oh, the authors, sorry, Raymond Murphy, M-U-R-P-H-Y, and Betty Azar, A-Z-A-R. And if those names come back time and time again in our Facebook, because other teachers, highly recommend these authors as well. There's a series of books both of them have written that cover different areas of the language, but they're probably two of the most known authors for ESL in ESL teaching.
Okay, great. Hey, okay, and then, I'm sorry, really quickly. Let me ask you. I think I'm just having a little bit of a technical problem here. I want to make sure that we still are. We're still broadcasting, and we are. Yes, great. Could you define register in a broad term before sharing the details, and then you can just kind of continue?
I would say the register is how careful, knowing your audience. How you adapt your language to your audience is the register that you need to use. So I guess how are you going to write to the Queen is going to be very different to how you will write an email to your employer, or how you will write certainly an email to somebody that you're going to go out and to the movies or the cinema with tonight. Yeah, that's register. And we do it unconsciously every day when we speak. We adapt the language generally, but it is certainly a skill. Because when we write, we're often writing to people we don't know, job advertisements, or we're writing for a very wide audience, a CV that might have to appeal to it's a subset of people, an employer, but it's certainly a different register of language. And the classic thing is to be able to write informal writing as well, for the hundreds of emails and texts that we do on a daily basis now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem. The next thing I wanted to talk about was coherence, and this is an area, for example, it can be a little bit harder at lower level of proficiency, because coherence really comes into play when you start putting sentences and paragraphs together, because you're looking for a logical flow. So at A1 and A2, you might just be looking at sentence construction, simple construction, or complex sentence construction. It's not until as soon as you start hitting linking words, that's where you want to start looking for coherence. So you set up a very short task that you want students to use linking words or signpost language in a systematic way, and therefore that language needs to link logically to the sentence or the ideas that have been expressed before. So that's the idea of coherence, something that we often don't give a lot of energy or thought to, because we want students to get words down on a page. But this is where going back over and looking at something like linking words or signpost language to see that what has actually been expressed is not just them getting out as much vocabulary as possible, but something that's written logically and that the audience can actually, the intended audience can actually follow. Accuracy, I won't go over too much because I focused on the idea of how many mistakes or which mistakes are you going to focus on? What is the purpose of the writing? If it's tenses, don't focus on articles too much. So accuracy is something that you want to be aware of, simply because writing is more permanent than speech, right? As soon as it's written down, if you're writing it in the chat or you're using Google Docs, however you're doing that online, you want to be, you want to have provided a purpose for the writing, so that as long as you've got the purpose, then you can focus on what needs to actually be accurate in the expression here as well. So fluency relates to the ease at which a student can write, and that's going to depend on the individual, and it's certainly going to depend at the different CEFR levels. So students can still be fluent, if you like, at A1, but they might be fluent at writing greetings. At C1, obviously we're hoping that students are far more fluent across a variety of writing tasks. Hopefully they can write perhaps a job application letter, if those things are still a thing in this day and age. But, you know, a summary of a movie or a book is very common at that level as well, if not earlier. So you're wanting students to build up fluency, and that's why it's a good idea to set the parameters of the task so that they can achieve something with a little bit of ease. You want them to, so repetition of a task is not a bad thing as well, because that can increase fluency. And for those of you who do like using writing to allow students to practice, say, grammar points, paraphrasing, rewriting the sentences with different words, using cognates in the language to improve vocabulary, they're all really good tasks to build up fluency at any proficiency level. Okay, so over to the right-hand side of the screen, I'll talk briefly, I'll talk now about process writing. So I think this is something that you can really get into once a student is at B1. What I would probably mean at B1 is that you've gone through quite a few of the narrative tenses. The students would be maybe getting familiar with passive constructions.
James, can I pause you for a moment?
Of course.
I want to talk about these skills. What I'd like to ask you about, because you've gone over these 4 skills: register, coherence, accuracy, and fluency. So can we make it really practical for a moment? Like, how, as a teacher, how do I, if I'm learning about these skills for the first time, or if I'm not super familiar with them, how is this going to help me teach writing more effectively, both in the context of using the off-to-class step-by-step curriculum and outside of that context? Like, how does it help me?
How does it help you as a teacher?
Yes.
Well, I think one of the things that we often do on the cuff in when teaching online is we do have to go with the flow a little bit. And I think it's really important that when you're going through a lesson, I think I've mentioned this before, it's not really possible or optimal for teachers to simply go through every single slide in order that we've written it. Because right, as much as we'd like to think that that works for every teacher, the reality is that you want to do what the students are, you need to move through at the pace the students need to go at. And also, if you're teaching multiple students, you will need to jump around from time to time. I guess we've talked about adaptability before, and I think it's really, really important that teachers can be fantastic teachers if they can learn to be adaptable. So the idea of showing teachers these skills around register, coherence, accuracy, and fluency, I believe allows teachers to be more adaptable in any lesson that they find themselves. If they find themselves in a writing task or a speaking task, there's no reason, because even in writing and speaking and reading, register, coherence, accuracy, and fluency are already there as well. Mm-hmm. And you could go in and have a look. For example, if you're a teacher and you find yourself in a reading activity, and you start talking with the students about, what was the purpose of the, we often ask students around what was the purpose, why did the author write this, who is the author writing for? Once you speak about that, you're starting to speak about register. If you've got a reading activity in front of you, you can look for coherence, because writing, when you're reading a text, the author has all generally used signpost language and linking skills. Accuracy, obviously, we hope that, give or take a few errors, that most of what appears in our curriculum is accurate. And obviously you can't determine fluency in something like that, but you can in a listening activity, right? You can listen to something and think about how fluent that person was. And we all have different measures of fluency depending on the topic that we're talking about. If you want me to talk about mechanics, I will absolutely not be fluent. I'd like to think I've got some fluency on this topic, but so these are skills, I think, that any teacher can use where they find themselves anywhere in a lesson and they think this is a good time to introduce a writing activity. And I think that's really what teachers should do, as much as we want them to follow the curriculum because that will go along with the learning development that happens with the expected language learning. But I think it's important to mix it up as much as possible. So the idea is this will give teachers the skills to be as adaptable as possible. And adaptability makes you a far better teacher than just following the curriculum from slide 1 to end.
I think this type of knowledge is really important, because when we look at the teacher notes that are next to one of the slides, there's not a lot of room in those teacher notes. I know that was one of the constraints when you were creating the teacher notes along with the slides. There's only so much space, right? This is not like a teacher workbook on a textbook where the actual textbook takes up 25% and the teacher notes take up the 75% on like the left and bottom margins. So when there might be a question, if there's something on a slide, you have written, for example, in some places, what was the author's purpose of writing this text? And so when a teacher sees a question like that, if we don't know about register, then it might not occur to me why that's an important question. So why do I even ask the student this question that's here? Because I don't know what this question is driving at. But knowing, okay, asking what the purpose of the text is making sure the student understands what register means, as in, why does the author understand their audience, and why are they writing in a certain tone relative to their audience? And so that can help me as a teacher make sure that my student understands the right language to use for the right circumstance. Because just as an example, I have a student who is extremely informal. Informal is the politest word that I can put on it. And so we have to talk about register a lot because he's too informal. He's not formal enough. And by knowing about that, about writing for an audience, then it can help us contextualize some of these things. So I went a little bit into detail there, but I think it is important to understand how these skills are reflected in a very practical way in the step-by-step curriculum, and how as a teacher, knowing these skills can help them teach better lessons.
Absolutely, and you mentioned a couple of really good things there, but I would just note that a good adaptable teacher will also ask very simple comprehension. Maybe I should have said this, just state it, that comprehension check. Gosh, I've forgotten the term. Comprehension check questions are a really good way. Even if the student is not at the point, you can ask yes/no questions. This text, like the text we're reading now, did he write to his friend? Did he write And then, of course, role playing as a teacher, if you're comfortable with that, is a fantastic way of getting students to change what they're doing, whether it's a speaking task. Okay, now I'm your neighbor. Okay, now I'm your teacher. Now I'm the president of whatever. You can get people to learn very quickly because they will know, even if they don't, you register might come across as a fairly, I don't know, unnecessary term perhaps, but it's something that you can work out through comprehension questions and through role playing. It's very, you get people to play different roles. We adapt immediately, right? Our body language, the speech that we use, so that can actually bring on a very natural change in how the student's going to speak, write, listen, or how they're going to write or speak.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic, James. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you can go on with process writing, because I wanted to sort of just really connect it. Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, I mentioned that, you know, I think that process writing can start and process writing, I guess, is long form writing. So the idea of, you know, a paragraph and beyond, and what you will be looking for there more is looking at the structure. But what I really want to focus on here is that in an online lesson, you won't always get to a drafting and editing stage, but I don't want teachers to undervalue the other things that can happen in a pre-writing activities that you might be able to cover in, you know, in the online environment, in the synchronous environment, and you can perhaps leave the writing, drafting, and then editing to a later lesson, or you can set that up as a homework task when students do need a longer period of time and it doesn't pay for you to be there. If you've set it up with brainstorming, clustering, questioning, and some, you know, the general pre-writing stuff, then students can go in and feel comfortable about drafting and editing. And I particularly mentioned this before with in the listening webinar, we're setting everything up. If it takes you 5 minutes to set up the listening task before students listen to a 90-minute audio recording, then spend the 5 minutes. Make sure that you drag as much as you can out of the images and the text and the questions before you get them to launch into a production activity. So here, it's pretty simple, but I still think that a pen and paper go well in an online environment. There's nothing wrong with having them. I still encourage students to keep a notebook. They might not refer back to them as often as we like, but I still think that they can be very beneficial, at least in the short term, for students to go back. So keep a pen and paper on hand, at least for the student. Brainstorming is a pretty well-known task where basically you write a topic and then anything that comes to mind. So these won't be full sentences, they will be words, maybe collocations, some idioms that will come out, but that all starts to set up the context for the student. Clustering is a similar type of thing, or mind mapping, where you have one idea and then other ideas that appear around that. So I guess it's a more extended version of brainstorming. And then questioning is something that I think we probably forget to do, but it can be a really simple thing to ask the who, what, why, where, and how of images, about the speakers in listening activities. They can be really good ways of drawing out vocabulary, and answering those can be the who, what, why, when, and how. The answers can be very simple written questions in the chat box or somewhere else on the screen for the students to practice very quickly. Drafting and editing, as I said, I won't go into here. I think that certainly has its place, but it's generally offline in an asynchronous environment. I'd certainly be interested in hearing from teachers who do make students write online for, say, longer than 5 minutes. I don't think it's necessarily a beneficial use of students' time, because it's not the same as the physical classroom where you can monitor students by, you know, the old way of wandering between the desks and looking over students' shoulders and seeing if they're, you know, getting on with the task. I think it's something in this day and age, if you're teaching online, that you probably have to do asynchronously and then bring back and do it as part of the correction activity in the following lesson. But I'd be interested to see if there are teachers who do go to the drafting and editing stage online. So that's really what I wanted to cover, Chris.
Okay, I have a couple of questions, especially when we talk about these pre-writing activities. So the first question that I have is this only for an academic or test prep context, or are these pre-writing activities applicable across other contexts as well?
I think they're even applicable at lower levels of proficiency, even if you're not going to lead up to a full process writing activity. The idea of brainstorming is really good because an image can bring 1,000 words to the fore,
Mhm.
and I think it's great for students to physically write things down and connect them. Kinesthetic learners, people who have to do. I'm certainly one of those. I still jot stuff down. If I'm trying to learn through German, I still write every word down in all of its, yeah, right. So I still think these are applicable at any level, even if you don't get to a final writing, a drafting, editing, and final writing stage. I think the idea of bringing all of these words together, certainly around vocabulary, it helps put things together in lexical chunks, in themes as well. So yeah, I think those tasks don't have to necessarily lead to a final piece of writing at lower levels of proficiency.
Okay, what about for like a completely different context, right? Like, what about for something like business English? Do these pre-writing activities have any place in ESP style people who are adults and are looking at it and want to improve English, just to improve their ability in their day-to-day life, who are not necessarily going to be academic or test prep students?
Okay, this is going to be more a personal point of view than a professional point of view, and it's certainly not based on any evidence that I've read. But my understanding is, and perhaps this is what every middle-aged person says, that writing has gone a little bit downhill over time,
Hmm.
and I think today one of the things that we are losing is that we don't instill in students at a young enough or an early enough stage of their education the idea that you are writing for a purpose and that you're writing for an audience. And so I think this is helpful across life, not just not just in the writing, not just to become a better writer, but
Sure.
communication. We learn another language to communicate effectively, and communication is such a powerful tool to have as a human. So I really think that anything that slows down, we feel like words come more easily,
Hmm.
so it's easy to feel like you get your message across. It's easy just to keep talking and talking. But I think with writing, because there is a purpose and there is an audience, you have to bring it down and distill it far more to its essence. And I just think that's a great skill to have, especially when you get to the stages, if you do, to be able to write in a foreign language a persuasive or an argumentative essay is no mean feat. And the
Hmm.
fact that you will have had to go through all of the grammatical points to get there, as well as learning register coherency and building fluency, I think they're incredible tools right across. Yeah, they're good tools for life.
Okay, I completely agree with that, especially when you talk about uh, the fact that we're writing all the time. We need to accomplish things through writing. We're trying to get what we want. We're trying to get answers to questions. We're trying to obtain things. And look, this is experience as an English speaker, right? As an English speaker, if my writing skills are not good, I'm going to be ineffective. I'm not going to be able to get what I want out of work. I'm not going to be able to get what I want out of life. I need to be able to write in a clear and concise way. My last question is: when we look at these skills and the process writing, how does a knowledge of this help an off to class teacher using the step by step curriculum?
Sorry, I was just thinking about something else you said. I'm going to have to make you repeat that repeat that question. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So when we look at these skills and these process and pre-writing things together, how does this help a teacher using the step-by-step curriculum to teach online ESL with off to class?
Well, I think a lot of, I would like to think that we do, using the curriculum, we do set up writing activities. And as I've said, as you mentioned, actually, that in the curriculum units, aside from A1, the other CEFR units will focus on writing in the 4th lesson of the unit. But I don't want teachers to underestimate the value of bringing in writing at much earlier stages, doing a 5-minute writing activity, even in a lesson that's based on listening. We also have well, I don't know how to describe it, but one of the issues, if you like, around language learning that's hard to get around is the fact that we often divide tasks into grammar, reading, listening, speaking, writing, and I've missed one out. But the reality is that, some are receptive, some are productive, but they go hand in hand all the time. Rarely do you read about something and just go, move to the next slide. Of course, you're going to ask questions about it, right? Sure. When you read something, let's write about it. When you listen to something, let's write about that. Summarize what you've just heard in writing, not in speech. So I think it reflects to bring in writing as you go through the off to class curriculum, even if the slide in front of you has a reading, listening, or speaking task on it. There's no reason to reflect what we do in real life. We often read something and then we quickly provide that information to somebody else over the phone, right? That's the classic thing. Writing is just a little bit harder. It takes more patience, and as I've said, I think the IELTS and TOEFL scores, they are lower across those bands, across cultures, and I think it's because it's a harder thing to learn. And I don't know that most of that is related to I know there's a lot of talk around technology has reduced our need for writing, and perhaps that is the case. I know, for example, that with the predictive, I don't know if you guys, the people watching this, are using Google Suite products. I'm sure there are a lot now. And I've noticed in the last few months, Google starts to predict not just the word that I'm writing, but the final string.
Yes.
The final word in the sentence, right? Turn that off. Turn that off for EFL students, because as much as I love technology, I don't know how much that's going to help. Anyway, that really went off from your question, but I think the idea is to make writing a far more natural process than we do for a lot of teachers in ESL. And you have to remember that students have often been through another education system, and perhaps not, nobody enjoyed writing at school. Really, there are a few gifted people for whom it came really, really quickly, but nonetheless, it is still a vital, as I said, communication, the most powerful tool we have. Therefore, writing is one of those skills that you want to have in order to communicate effectively.
Wonderful. James, thank you so much. For anyone who doesn't know, of the 1,000 lessons that exist in the Off to Class lesson library, 90% of them were written by James. And yes, he's had help and proofreaders and people writing questions, but the majority of the work over the last 6 years has been James writing these lessons, all of them one by one. We Off to Class has kind of gotten big enough that I think we don't, I don't mention that, right? I don't mention that James is the person who wrote all of the lessons we use. So thank you so much, James. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. And you're an excellent resource in terms of helping teachers do things that are strong pedagogically. So thank you so much for your time. Anyone who is listening, feel free, if you have questions that we were not able to get to today, or if you're watching the replay, leave your question in a comment and James will come back later to answer them the best that he can.
Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. And thanks to those of you who watched.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, James, thank you so much. And everyone watching, have a great day or evening. We'll see you another time. Bye, everyone.